Welcome back to part 3. Now we're going to be looking at exploring social change, masculinities and patriarchy. So gender socialization, I guess, over time means that what gender means has changed, the roles change because society and cultural norms have changed. So in the past, women were definitely mainly confined to the home in the role of mother, caregiver, housewife. Men traditionally were breadwinners. Of course, Mad Men, or this picture here is sort of the traditional model from the 1950s onwards. This has changed over time, obviously, but it still has a pretty strong legacy, particularly in the division of household labour, division of caring responsibilities, and things like that. So whilst it's not quite as constrained as this anymore, it's still pretty common for this to be the overall model in terms of the caring, working responsibilities. Women do occupy more spaces in public life now, in politics, in positions of leadership. I mean, they exist, but it's not anywhere near parity in terms of the numbers we see in these different sectors. Even though women are obviously in employment in high numbers, they're also taking the burden of care in such high proportions that it constrains the overall picture of equality when it comes to gender roles and the family. So some huge changes happened in the 70s onwards, which meant that women had higher access to higher education than ever before. They would then often be moving into white collar work, professional roles, teachers, for example, nurses. There was a huge expansion of the middle class that occurred during this time of relative prosperity in the 70s, post-war boom. And there was a declining full-time work and increasing casualisation that also occurred in the labour market. So women have entered higher education in really high numbers since the 1970s and have entered the workforce, but in different patterns than the breadwinner home caregiver model. We don't see men staying at home in even numbers of women. This looks different in other countries in the world. For example, in Denmark, who have a completely different socialist welfare state, there is gender parity in relation to workforce participation and in caring roles, because they have a full welfare state where there is childcare provided for all children, meaning that women don't have to leave the workforce when they have children. That's one of the main differences in our societies. Other changes that have occurred over the past decades have been rises in the costs of living, housing and education, which have meant that both household members, adults, needed to work. It used to be possible to only survive on one wage in the 50s, 60s and 70s. That sort of started changing in the 90s and onwards. So even though there's women are working, it's still not in the same way. And of course, access to birth control and family planning are also in the 70s. All these things sort of collided at the same time with the resurgence of second wave feminism during that time period as well. It meant that women's bodies were autonomous, that women were able to control birth control themselves, in that they could manage it through a pill rather than having to negotiate that with a husband or anything who could largely control that. So these were all huge changes that have happened in the lives of women over the past few decades, and you would be able to obviously talk about this with older women in your life, and even think about what your older aunties or grandmothers, what kind of work they did, if they worked, what kind of caring roles they had, and see if that has sort of changed over time in the people in your life and that you know. It may not have. It's sort of, while societal changes have occurred very broadly, the kind of entrenched nature of gendered inequality in terms of roles around caring and work, and those expectations around labour force, I mean, these are really intractable inequalities that we're dealing with. So there is a really large wage gap still. I mean, It is decreasing slightly over time, but this is one of the main ways that we measure the differences in all kinds of life chances or kind of equity of opportunity for women. So women's full-time wages are still only around 80% of men's wages. That's often because of differences in the long-term ways that women are paid. So in relation to superannuation balances, or often their work is being concentrated in lower paid sectors like nursing or childcare, service and teaching. So this kind of pay gap exists because women often take time out of work they must take care of their children, because if they don't, no one else will, because there's not that equity of childcare responsibility that's societally the norm. It's also not possible, or is much less possible for men to have access to paid parental leave than it is for women. So all these are kind of structural factors that really impinge upon gender equity. Of course, women don't get paid superannuation if they are in the same rate if they're working part-time or in casual work. All of these kinds of differences add up over the course of a woman's working life to create the gender wage gap. There's also gender segregation is a really clear way that this plays out as well. So this means that women and men seem to be really separated in terms of what kinds of jobs they do, what kinds of sectors they're concentrated in. So this happens in leisure as well, in the kinds of sporting practices that men and women take part in or don't, the kind of activities, even the amount of leisure time is a key factor in difference between men and women. So Australians tend to believe this kind of segregation of men in particular areas of work and women in others is natural, but it's just not as profound in other areas. So this is, I think, a key kind of cultural difference in Australia that it's interesting to look at in terms of the sociological imagination, making the familiar look strange. So yeah, I guess the value is different and the activities are different. It's another way of being able to look at this phenomena. So in terms of the gendered division of labour, despite women's relative educational successes, women often end up in jobs that are much more insecure, low paid or low status. So how we measure work and working hours is really important, because there's very few women now who don't work at all. But it might be more interesting to look at gender inequality or the division of labour here to think about who does the caring work, who does the unpaid work, because that really shows up more so than participation in the labour force, how these things are divided and what power looks like, and what constraints, I guess, relate to these divisions. So women's work or women's jobs often are undertaken expressly so they're able to juggle family responsibilities at the same time. So flexible work is preferred, and it's required, obviously, because somebody has to take care of children. They must be cared for by somebody in the house, and it's just seen to be the norm and the kind of expectation that will fall on women. I think it's really important to point out too that the, I guess, compounding impacts of stress, mental load is a term you might have heard, around these combined commitments and requirements. So the Australian Institute of Family Studies is that link there, AIFS. They have put out many recent studies that you can have a look on their website to see over time how these patterns map. So women take on the majority of caring roles and managing the household, managing children. And I guess the compounding stress of this is one of the key indicators of inequality for women. So 74% of women feel stressed balancing work and family commitments compared to 57% of men. So that's probably because women are on balance doing this work in much higher proportions than men. There's the expectation that men just do not not sort of required to step in as much, and it's sort of seen as being there's a whole lot of tropes and memes about, you know, the husband doing the babysitting so the woman can go out and, you know, go to yoga or go to do something else. But and of course it's not babysitting if it's your own child, but there's that expectation that women by default are the ones who, again, looking at those caring stereotypes around femininity that we looked at in the previous part of the lecture, there's just completely different expectations, and this plays out so heavily here. Relatively speaking, men do very little housework and not much childcare compared to women, that's for sure. So in terms of housework, there are vast differences in the volumes and time that women spend doing housework compared to men. This increased certainly over COVID, even though everybody was home during that period of time. Women were still doing 21 more hours of unpaid work, even though everybody's in the house at the same time during that time. And little has changed since then. That just sort of showed that it's not around just who happens to be home, it's around the responsibilities that people have or feel that they have. And looking at masculinities is a really key aspect of gender sociology as well. One of our most prominent and eminent sociologists in Australia is Raewyn Connell, who is a scholar of gender and masculinities. You will have read her work. So it's important, I guess, to look at what comprises masculinities in relation to these gender divisions of labour we've been looking at, and also to the stereotypes we looked at earlier and gender theory. So masculinity is always come into existence at particular times and places and are always subject to change, she argues, and it's really important. So masculinity is not one thing, it's not one trope or one ideal. In reality, in everyday life, masculinities are as diverse as the people who identify with them and practice them. Dominant definitions of masculinity are embedded in social institutions like in the state, education and the family. And it's these, I guess, dominant forms and definitions that are of particular interest to sociologists, as well as the more everyday forms. So this is not around focusing on personality and behaviour, where, of course, as sociologists looking at the non or more than biological aspects here, because how things evolve over time and are culturally shaped is really important, because otherwise we're not really equipped to understand how and why things change. So hegemonic masculinity is Raewyn Connell's key concept. This thinks and, I guess, explains how power works in relation to patriarchy, but it sort of uses the term hegemonic instead to understand the dominant forms of masculinity at the moment. So this is to say that male power isn't simply held by individual men, but it's institutionalized and really legitimized in the social structures and ideologies that help to ensure or shore up the gender order that tend to benefit men in general. But all men don't directly benefit from the ideals of hegemonic masculinity. It's just the dominant forms of masculinity, and those who practice it benefit from it. But of course, these can also harm men, example being around practices of violence, very narrow expectations for masculinity, and all kinds of mental health concerns that relate to that, which is a different topic, although very aligned. So hegemonics is not the same as dominance. Different definitions may exist as hegemonic, but they're all different, but they're broadly masculine. So they're in relation to political power, for example, or sporting prowess, or of course the military. These are all culturally exalted forms of masculinity, and they have actual power attached to them in relation to not only the imaginaries that we hold of them, but in terms of their ability to sort of hold value, be looked up to, and create huge hugely impactful changes or settings for the rest of society. So culturally exalted traits is what Connell calls these of hegemonic masculinity, and they're usually around look like being white, heterosexual, having real focus on rationality and independence. So masculinity is always contested. These dominant forms and hegemonic forms change over time, and very few men actually occupy the hegemonic position celebrated in a particular culture. There'll be key sort of idols or figureheads, but this is sort of not the everyday experience of masculinity, but the fact it's a reference point is very important. So people who diverge from this very narrow, I guess, constraining form of hegemonic masculinity are marginalised and experience very physical and real impacts associated with transgressing or not meeting these standards. But Connell argues that all men receive some measure of the patriarchal dividend, even if they're implicitly excluded from the ideals of hegemonic masculinity, which is a really interesting point when we're thinking about power and hierarchy, and those kind of earlier ideas of essentialism and power and dominance that we were talking about at the beginning of the lecture. These ideas go very deep in our kind of cultural and historical contexts. This is a really interesting example too, I think, because it shows, I guess, one way that the patriarchal dividend works in terms of how power is sustained for men by men as a group. This example is a visual map of recipients of ARC LEAF funding, which is infrastructure grants commencing in the last 10 years or so. This source is from an article called Australian Research Has a Diversity Problem, meaning, you know, that it's the kind of stereotype that there are more men named Dave that got a grant in a particular year than women did. This shows how the patterns of collaboration work, where men mainly work with other men. You can see this here where the recipients of the funding are in red and the blue are women, and you can see there's very few blue points in that whole map at all. I'd really encourage you to read that article. There's a lot of other really interesting examples in there around how the clustering of men working with other men and the kind of almost invisibility of women looks and can be related to hegemonic masculinity. Another concept here is around the patriarchal dividend, and this is around the kind of benefits, I guess, that accrue in relation to these aspects of gender hierarchy and the gender order we've been talking about. So this is in relation to the gender division of labour, where men collectively receive the bulk of income in the money economy and occupy most of the managerial positions, and where worldwide men tend to hold 9 out of 10 cabinet level positions in national governments and nearly as many of the parliamentary seats. So this is actual power at the top, right? This is who makes the decisions, who sets agendas, makes policies that affect everybody. So obviously if there are more men at the top, that is going to continue to perpetuate that situation. And this is what a lot of the kind of equal opportunity legislation and changes over time have sought to address, but there's obviously still a lot of work needing to be done here. And of course, the great benefits that men receive through the unpaid labour, or the unacknowledged benefits usually through the patriarchal dividend here in the case of heterosexual relationships. So patriarchy is not exclusively defined as relations between individual men and women, and it doesn't always act in the interests of the majority of men. But it's important, I guess, to look at this as a whole and to look at the striations of power and hierarchies and patterns. This collects, I guess, the things we're talking about, gendered socialization, the way that, I guess, all these different institutions and sectors, interactions, relationships, and aspects of culture contribute to this overall dominance of patriarchy, which is, you know, more or less unquestioned. We tend to go along with this as just part of our day-to-day life. It is part of the fabric of how we've been raised. And unless you've learned about this in an early age and already been questioning it, you will probably start to be seeing it more around you now in just these micro relations, but also in the institutions you interact with at work, maybe at university, in your friendship groups, in your personal life, in your family. So it's a useful concept, but it's also been challenged, I guess, because it only tends to look at one aspect of gender dominance, whereas more contemporary theory in social sciences looks at intersectionality, or the ways that compounding aspects of oppression and power relationships in relation to race, in relation to class, location, ability, all these other aspects. Gender and patriarchy is just one of those aspects of oppression that's important to look at. So patriarchy doesn't cover the ways that those are intersecting. So we'll look at this a bit more in the next section of the lecture.